Welcome to the show. My name is Craig WK, and with me is Captain Kyle Randall Tanzik from Michigan Medieval. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing good. Yes, I'm Captain Kyle Randall Tanzik from Michigan Medieval. I am a HEMA instructor, which is an acronym for Historical European Martial Arts, and my background is in Japanese martial arts. I've trained in Japan, I've trained in Italy, and I've trained in the United Kingdom. Throughout that whole time, I've also done sport fencing, and I do BAFR combat, full contact LARP fighting in costumes and stuff. Very excited to talk about role playing today. Craig, why don't you introduce what we're talking about today?
Yeah, so Kyle, it's great to have you be chatting with you here. We're talking about real life versus Dungeons and Dragons medieval combat. And I'm glad that you brought this up, that you wanted to chat about this. And I feel like if reality is your wheelhouse, fantasy must be mine because I am the dungeon master for Noobs and Dragons, a Dungeons and Dragons podcast. I also am on the Legend of Retro show. Plenty of stuff over at the GameZilla Media Network. And so, yeah, if you have that whole reality thing, real life, then I have all the made up stuff, and that's what I'm an expert on, which
You are.
is weird.
So before we get too much into this, I just want to make it clear that talking about Dungeons and Dragons or any fantasy kind of combat, today we're not talking about things that involve magic. And so if you ever hear me talking about sword fighting or any kind of effectiveness of a technique or whatever, we're specifically avoiding things with in the realm of magic, because that's we don't have a lot of historical texts that talk about the use of magic in sword fights. Or I mean, if we ever find one, that'd be pretty cool. But so we're just going to talk about things that reflect the realities and accuracy or not that you might.
Well, there go all my notes about magic.
Oh no.
so, uh, so we want to talk about the difference between the fantasy side of uh, D&D and the real life side of medieval combat, but also kind of how they kind of come together and sort of get some things right.
Absolutely.
You had this game, Dungeons and Dragons, created by Gary Gygax, David Arneson, and so they had roots in sort of appreciation for medieval combat reenactments and stuff like that.
Yes.
And so some things kind of show. Uh, for example, one of the big things that we're going to talk about, which I think is should be our first stopping point, is uh, you know the amount of time you have in a turn, which in Dungeons and Dragons is you have like an action, you can move or have an action, maybe a bonus action if it's something small. And Kyle, you had mentioned that that's related to something referred to as tempo. Would you let some of our listeners know exactly what that entails?
Absolutely. So in the early Renaissance in Italy, we have the term tempo defined, which literally just means time, I believe. And it just shows that anything you do takes one time period, one tempo. And so if you want to throw a cut, that's a tempo. You want to throw a parry, that's a tempo. You want to take a step, that's a tempo. And you can do more than one thing at a time, like taking a step with a cut, that's a tempo. This is something that D&D did very closely get right. It actually does reflect what we have in Renaissance manuscripts and later in history too. But that's a big one in that no matter what you're doing, you only have that one moment to do it. And yeah, they really did get that one right for D&D for sure.
Yeah, it's and for the people who are stuck in real life like losers, the Dungeons and Dragons side of things is you have 6 seconds as a combat round, and so in your turn during said 6 seconds, yeah, you can move, you can act, and if you act, typically it's like attacking or some other fantastical thing. But in the case of sort of applying reality to it, that would be your opportunity to be able to launch an offensive, and things of that nature. So that's kind of interesting that the timeline of that is maybe a little bit in question. Because you've, Kyle, felt like 6 seconds is an exceedingly long time for something like that. Is that right?
Oh, I don't know, maybe not exceedingly long, but it's 6 seconds is a long time in a sword fight. And that's another one thing that I wanted to talk about being maybe something that doesn't exactly reflect reality is that in real life, sword fights are very short. We're talking like 1 hit point short, because if someone swings a sword and hits you in the head with it, that's your 1 hit point. That's you're done.
You
Um,
did.
you can't take too many of those. So one thing people will say to this is that you often see armored combat tournaments happening for Battle of the Nations, kind of historical medieval battle HMB tournaments, and you can see people with weapons that are blunt hitting people in helmets and breastplates, and because they don't want to be like a murderer, they're doing it in a safe way with like safe weapons and precautions and things to emulate medieval tournament fighting. And so if you look at the medieval manuscripts that we work with, I can think of like Codex Wallenstein. You can look at Fiore Battaglia. So these are like 15th century manuscripts from Germany and Italy. Even in armor, they'll quickly take a parry, close to grapple, and then somebody's getting a dagger through the eye slit in their helmet.
Ooh.
Somebody's dagger into the armpit or up in the groin or something. There's even a Fiore di Liberi play from Fiore Battaglia where he closes the grapple and he lifts up his enemy's helmet visor and stabs him in the face with a pole axe.
Oh man!
We're like, surprise!
Peekaboo!
Like, yeah. And so like even in armor, like these fights are super quick. Like I'm talking, you might get like one parry, one cut, and then like somebody's not having a good day. 6 seconds is a long time in a sword fight. Maybe like I don't know. I'm not. I don't know enough about. I don't know. I'm not a game designer. I couldn't tell you how short it should be, but 6 seconds is a long time.
That's fair. That's interesting. It's funny. It almost makes me think of the video game Bushido Blade, an old PlayStation fighting game where you fight with swords, and it's like one hit kills. If you get hit in the head, you're just dead, and
Yep.
that's real life. Like you don't have hit points. Your eighth level fighter with 97 hit points. Yeah, they can take multiple hits, but I guess it also kind of depends on how the dungeon master is portraying things. Are all those hit points amounting to the fact that you're able to block and dodge more, and so it's just whittling down your health and stamina? Or is it that you get chopped in the head with an axe and you're just like, oh well, whatever, I got 70 more hit points, I'll manage?
I would also say that another sad reality of having only 1 hit point at a time and fights being so quick is that people striking each other with lethal blows at the same time, like simultaneously killing each other, absolutely was the reality of sword fighting. And it was that we both swing thinking, okay, I got him, and we both land, and surprise, we both did got him, and we both died.
That's interesting because in D&D that is almost unheard of because you roll for initiative. But the weird thing is that with Dungeons and Dragons, technically everything in a round, your enemy, allies, other enemies, whatever, are all technically operating within that 6 second period that they grant you in the rules. It's just a matter of whose turn is going first in the initiative order, as in how quick are they compared to you? They're gonna act faster or slower, whatever. So yeah, it's interesting that in real life sword fights, it was more likely that you would just lob each other's heads off. But in Dungeons and Dragons, it almost never happens.
There is in Kunsteffekt German tradition of sword fighting. It's defined pretty early on, it's defined in as early as the 15th century, that there is a concept of vor, nach, and ins, or indes. And basically the way that it works is they define sword fighting as being actions that happen while your opponent's preparing to attack, so before something happens. Indes, which is happening at the same time, simultaneously at the same time. And nach is right after something happens. So if they swing and miss, there's an opportunity where they've swung and missed, they're off balance, and you can quickly riposte and get them. If they're winding up to swing to attack, just before they attack, you can whip in and get them. And so this is quite technical. I'm not really sure how this would fit in with the D&D initiative kind of order of things, but there certainly is something to having a slight, either just before or just after. I think it's called Nachreisen, is like just after in German sword fighting. Because it's pretty close. It's pretty in the ballpark.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's fairly close. Now, you're bringing up of the idea of opportunity makes me think of opportunity attacks in Dungeons and Dragons, which, for those who don't know, is if you leave an adjacent square of your enemy without an action called disengage, where essentially you don't get hit by their opportunity attack, they have a chance to hit you. So here's my question to you: is in real life, if you and I were sword fighting and fairly close to each other, if you just bolted in the opposite direction, would I really have much of a clear shot at you to be able to hit you?
No.
I didn't think so.
No. I mean, basically, if we're within fighting range, that means this is called like measure. Often it's called measure in the text that we read. Basically, it means that we're just out of range to be able to hit each other, so that we can safely try and figure out what to do. And so that means we're in a safe distance apart where you couldn't just freely swing and strike me. Mm-hmm. So the idea of me backing up even further is like, it means I'm even farther out of range now. So if I back up at all, like your weapons just can't, don't have enough reach. If you have, I don't know if D&D reflects this or not, but if you are fighting with a long weapon, if you're fighting with a long spear or a lance or something, and I move a square away, I still have to watch my back, because no matter, if I'm, it's the ranges are different for each person based on the kind of weapon that they have. And often in history, the reality is that if you're in a fight to save your life, you get jumped on the street or whatever, in 14th century Venice or something, who knows where, you have no idea what that person's going to attack you with. You don't know if it's a 6-foot spear, or a 7-foot spear, or a 2-foot dagger, or a 18-inch dagger, or you have no clue what they're going to attack you with. And so, moving out of combat, you're just going to be moving even farther away.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's a rule in D&D set up to kind of punish you from running away from opponents and to potentially help you lock down the enemy. So mechanically in the game, I get why that's there. But you're right, realism-wise, why would stepping away make sense? Especially when you consider, in D&D, there are polearms, spears and, glaives and whatever, what have you. And you would think that would give you a more threatening reach for such things. But there's actually rules set up where your attack of opportunity range is only still 5 feet, even if you have a polearm, unless you have magic special abilities or whatever.
So I will ask you, Craig, and I ask this every time I do a demo, what do you think the most commonly carried weapon or weapon combination was in the medieval period?
The first thought is maybe short sword and shield, because of it being easy enough to carry. But it's hard not to want to say a spear, because it gives you distance and doesn't make you so close to the enemy.
You're absolutely on the right track. And so I have been told by credible museum curators and archaeologists, I won't name drop anybody or top my head, but I have been told that the most commonly carried weapon in the medieval period was a sword and buckler. So a one-handed arming sword and a small, maybe 12-inch punch grip shield. And the reason for this was just because anybody would carry it. If you look at something like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, if you look at the illustrations from it, this is a 15th century English book. They're not going to battle. They're going to church. But and they're also not fighters. They're they're just townspeople of various sorts, craftspeople, tradesmen. And they're depicted carrying sword and buckler because they're on the path and they're afraid of brigands, and so the average person would carry it. Therefore, everybody carried them. as for on actual battlefields where there's arrows flying and catapults and horses and things, the absolute overwhelming majority of people carried spears. And everybody, pretty much on the whole world, not just in the medieval Europe, but pretty much over the whole world, everybody had spears. Whether you're on a Pacific island or if you're in India or wherever, everybody had spears. And as soon as we had guns, we had rifles. We shot him once, bang! We stuck a bayonet at the end and turned it back into a spear. Like, like people, it's a very good weapon. It's like I want to stab somebody, but they're too far away. It's it's like
Yeah.
No brainer. You could also throw them, and so spears were really common for battlefields. Swords were like a backup weapon. Yeah.
It's funny because and this is just from my own personal insights in my own home games. I don't have like polled numbers or anything like that, but it strikes me that pole arms are not as widely used as other weapons in D&D because in D&D you'll typically have like sword and shield style where you can get a bigger armor bonus, or you have like big giant great swords and mauls and that do more damage, 2d6 compared to like the d10 for a pole arm, which mechanically I guess makes sense that you would want the bigger weapon, do more damage, maximize it, like from a math standpoint. But yeah, in a realistic sense, it probably makes way more sense that more people would have the pole arms.
In many ways, range is king. But I would also go on to add to that my previous statement about spears being great is that if you are in a tight closed space on a ship, or say in a dungeon, you don't want to have a spear or a polearm, because if you're trying to turn that thing, an enemy came up behind me, good luck flipping it over in like with a low ceiling in a tight hallway or whatever. If you got a poleaxe and you need a little bit of room to maybe swing it a little bit, it's going to be more effective to have something shorter. It's going to be more effective to have, like maybe even like a long sword, which is kind of like a long sword is a bit of like a Swiss Army knife weapon you can use. Or when I say long sword, I should say sometimes we encounter like bastard sword, hand and a half sword. In the historical European martial arts community, we kind of ubiquitously refer to this just as like a long sword.
Yeah.
And so it's like roughly 4 foot long. Use it with one hand, use it with two hands. I can open a door while I'm swinging it with my other hand. That might be a good choice for in a dungeon because it's not so long you bash the lights out. Lights, the things that we have in dungeons. Torches.
Sconces,
yeah.
So here's a question then. Sure, when you're out on the open battlefields that, reality would have you in, sure, you'll use spears likely and stuff. But when it comes to dungeons, like closed, kind of cramped corridors, that's what you think most people would end up using, is something like a longsword.
Well, you just don't want something that's too long.
That's fair. That's very fair.
So one thing that kind of reflects this that we can talk about is if you look at we'll talk about from like Napoleonic era, we have cutlass manuals that these are manuals that I personally work with. Probably there are other ones from earlier times, but so if you look at like British naval cutlasses, like they were, they're the most powerful empire in the world. They're trying to do everything as high tech as possible and be as efficient as possible. British Empire, and on their ships where they had tight spaces, they had lots of ropes and rigging that you don't want to cut. You had lots of other people cramped around you. The things they used were boarding pikes to try and keep people from getting onto the ship, and cutlasses. And so when you have something like a cutlass, it's got a guard that protects your hand. It's got a length that's not so long it might accidentally hit somebody or get hit some ropes or something. Or if you're beneath decks in a ship, it's a pirate sword. It's got like a 2 foot blade. It's a good weapon, and that's what the British Empire decided to give their sailors. Maybe that would be a good choice for a dungeon. I mean, that being said, I'd probably pair it with a shield if I had to save my own life.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a good call.
Why not?
So here's a question as we're bringing up shields and staying alive.
There's a song about that.
There is, and a very good one at that. Here's my next big question for you is a discussion about armor, because in Dungeons and Dragons, it's more important to have good armor than a shield. But for you in real life and medieval combat, that's not necessarily the case, is it?
So armor, depending on what year it is in the medieval period of the Renaissance, armor can be expensive or cheaper. Swords can be expensive or cheaper. As time goes on, things become less expensive, generally speaking, as things are more available. But the way that I described it to a student of mine was that, like, okay, imagine you're squaring up to fight your enemy. And we both have a sword and shield, and we're squaring up to fight. Okay, now take away your shield, and you're just standing there with just a sword. And you might be wearing armor, but basically what it means is that, like, if something got through your defense to hit you, a mistake was made, and the only thing that saved you was your armor. If you have a shield out in front of you, that thing can take punishment all day, and you don't have to worry about that maybe getting in a gap in the armor. If you can intentionally put it in the way. When something hits your armor, it's like you made a mistake and almost died. Uh, like that was close to being a really bad day, and so like maybe your last day. And so I would say, generally speaking, like I think most fighters would probably take the shield. I've never really asked around, but it just kind of seems apparent to me that like I've known many people who own shields, but not that many people who own suits of armor. So maybe that's part to do with it as well.
That could be, but it is funny because in the game mechanic of Dungeons and Dragons, when you look at that, you get a bigger number from your armor. So if you have plate mail or chain mail, whatever, that's going to give you a bigger number for your armor, and so it makes more sense to have better armor than a shield. But yeah, in real life, it's kind of the opposite. You don't want the enemy to get anywhere that their blade anywhere near you, and that shield is going to be the thing that does it.
Yeah, it's no coincidence that like almost all cultures have shields. Not all cultures have armor. You go back through history.
That's a very good way of putting it. Shields have have been a no-brainer throughout every society, but armor is a little bit more debatable, and I'm sure it must also have to do with like maneuverability
Yeah,
and also depending on climate. I'm sure just like the heat, like wearing armor is not cool.
how dare you? It's very cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure in more cooler climates like England or something, yeah, it's probably not so bad wearing a full suit of armor. But maybe when you're in the equator, it's not as fun when you're in the desert sun and it's beating down on you and you're in plate mail.
You'd be surprised. I mean, like it's awful. Like wearing armor is hot, and in the summer in England or in the summer in any part of Europe, like it's hot. It's hot. And it's just you do hear accounts of people just passing out. I mean, like there were crusades fought where there was lots of people in armor and both sides, and people just learned to handle it or they didn't. And certainly, if you look at places that if we look at African cultures, there is iron armor. There is armor. There are suits of armor in Africa. There are suits of armor in Mesoamerica, and so like they're around, but it's more of like a resources thing. There's a time and a place to be wearing everything.
Yeah.
It's more of like a time and place thing rather than like a practicality thing, because like you're wearing a big iron suit. The only thing on the top of your mind is I hope I don't get hit with an arrow or a spear or something. That's
I
overheating getting compared to like getting stabbed or whatever. So it's more just a time and place thing.
I gotcha. I gotcha. So, we've discussed armor. There are a few things I want to discuss when it comes to the weapons themselves. Because we've been discussing, daggers, long swords, maybe pole arms. But how common were what I would view as a more eccentric weapon, like maces and flails and, like war hammers? Are things like that are common in Dungeons and Dragons maybe not so common throughout history?
This is a fantastic question, and this is actually this has to do with a bit of a myth that is very very commonly portrayed in like movies and books and everything.
Mm-hmm.
There's kind of this idea that like if you're like a poor peasant, not wearing a ton of armor, you're gonna fight with like crude weapons like axes and maces and hammers and flails and things like that, And then if you're, if you're like a fancy knight with like lots of armor, you might fight with a sword. But the that's in time and place that is true. But generally speaking, if you are someone who is an unarmored combatant fighting against other lightly or unarmored combatants, you're not going to use a hammer because, like, what do you need it for? The guy you're fighting is probably not going to be wearing anything that needs to get rehammered out. So you're going to be fighting with sharp, pointy, long objects. If you are a knight on a horseback, if you are a heavy infantry in heavy armor, you need a can opener. You need something that looks like it was. You need a hammer that looks like it was used to make armor because you're going to about to unmake armor. So you need that flail. You need that heavy hammer, that heavy mace. That's what you need to fight guys in armor because you're an armored combatant. If there's a mismatched situation where you have unarmored combatants fighting against heavy armored combatants, something has gone terribly wrong with this battle. Like somebody pulled a clever maneuver. But generally speaking, like if you are in heavy armor, you're going to be fighting against other heavy armored troops. That's the way that battles are won, generally speaking. And so you're going to need can opener weapons. Yeah. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. That's interesting. So big hammers and stuff were likely more common than I would think. Depending on what they, the sides fighting and the availability and whatnot. But when it comes to something like a flail, is that as common? Because it feels like that's more of a fantastical weapon to me.
So, from my perspective, as someone who works with medieval manuscripts, I can tell you that we have in medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, we have instructions with vivid illustrations on how specifically to fight with flails. In particular, are like a 4 to 5 foot long two-handed flail, and that's like mostly pole with like a flail weight on the end. And we have evidence in these manuscripts of things like judicial duels being fought with them. And other like this to me this almost sounds like fiction, but it's reality, and that people were fighting duels or making combat in without armor on with giant flails. And these are weaponized flails. These are not like wheat threshing flails. They have spikes on them. Like they are clearly meant to hurt people. I think anybody can pick up a flail and be like, I could really mess somebody up with this. Let's put some spikes on it. And they're not a farming implement. Clearly, they were inspired by a farming implement. But yeah, we have evidence for flails.
Interesting. Now, my final question when it comes to weaponry would be the absolutely more eccentric stuff. So, like, I can't imagine it's real, but there is in old editions of Dungeons and Dragons, and you and I have talked about this in the past, the dire flail.
Oh my word! So anything that's like a dire thing, there's one weapon that we have a manual for. Specifically talks about a weapon called a Jägerstock. And a Jägerstock is a spear with a spearhead on each end. A dire spear. If you have a dire sword, a dire flail, a dire axe, I remember seeing these in like the 3.5 edition player handbook, like the dire, basically means double-ended weapon. I'm just looking at that going like, man, that's an awful lot of sword pointing back the wrong way towards you. Indeed. I mean, like we have things like in Talhofer, Hans Talhofer, we have like a 1465 Wartenberg treatise. I think maybe it's in there, and other Talhofer treatises. So he was a Swabian, which is like southwestern Germany in the 15th century, and he has some very eccentric weapons. He has a pole axe that you can like has screws and nails and things, and you can unscrew it and rebuild your pole axe in different ways if you need to. And we have swords with spiked pommels. And in Fiore di Liberi, which is my favorite manuscript to work with, is Fiore Battaglia, which is late. It's he was born at the height of the Black Plague. He was born in 1350, and the plague reached its peak in 1349. So he grew up in a world that was like almost like a Mad Max, like plague-riven place.
Yeah.
He depicts in his manuscript spiked pommels on swords, and certainly we have spiked butt caps on pole axes. That's the thing, and sometimes they're used in manuals where people will kind of like parry with the front end and then stab you with the back end. So like it's kind of getting in the ballpark of like a dire something. If you have like if you have a halberd that has a spike in the back end, yeah, but that's about all you're gonna get is like a spike. And sorry.
Hey, no, I sort of figured, the orcish double axe and the dire flail, things like that, just didn't really seem like they'd be real. But it's interesting to think that a small blade at the end of a pole arm, that's sort of a no brainer because it wouldn't be near you anyway because it's a pole arm.
Sure.
Yeah, that stands to reason.
Yeah.
Uh, oh, go on.
So one thing that on the topic of having two ends on your weapon,
Yeah.
one thing that doesn't always one thing that for me that stands out as not necessarily reflecting reality is when you have a fighter or a fighting character who has reached a certain level in his skills that he can attack 2 times per every one attack his opponent gets with only using not necessarily with the second weapon, but with just one weapon. If you can attack 2 times, this clashes with the tempo we talked about earlier, where everything you do takes one tempo. The idea of attacking twice as fast, provided we're not magically manipulating time or warping reality or anything, being able to throw 2 attacks in this time it takes your opponent to throw 1 attack. This is not. No amount of training will ever bring you to this point where you can, do 2 tempos in 1 tempo worth of time.
I think that with Dungeons and Dragons, you have wizards throwing spells and paladins calling forth the light and clerics healing people. So I think that in order to bring that fantastical element to like the fighter class and other classes that are a little bit more down to earth, so to speak, I think that that notion of being so fast and powerful that you can launch multiple blows for your opponent's one blow is sort of just the natural progression of things in that game where you need to be able to let's face it, the fighter class might be great at level 1, but if by level 20 the wizard's throwing out the ability to stop time and throw fireballs and you're just like, I'm gonna hit him once. But oh, okay, yeah, this class sucks now, So I think that's a reflection of that. But it's funny because it's not even in Dungeons and Dragons just 2 attacks. Like a fighter at the peak of their ability in Dungeons and Dragons can, I think, for every time they attack 4 times. If they have an offhand weapon, they attack a 5th time with their bonus action, and then if the fighter class has an ability called Action Surge, where you get an additional action and then do whatever you want. So if you use your bonus action to Action Surge, you attack 4 times, and then another 4 times. So that'd be 8 times in 6 seconds.
Man, I think if I was fighting somebody who it was their very first day ever, and they really didn't know what was going on, maybe you could get 2. If you're really trying to be an a-hole and be like, I'm gonna mess this new guy up, which you should never do. But if that's the only maybe if they were just like, wow, what's happening, and maybe you could get 2, but that many. The one thing I would point out that D&D got right is that if you have 2 weapons, indeed you do throw twice as many attacks. And the difference is I think the wording is a bit different. In real life, they'll happen simultaneously. And so if you see things like we have it's dual wielding isn't a huge thing in the manuscripts that we work with, but we have things like there's a famous artist named Albrecht Dürer, and he drew sketches of fighters, and one of them is a dude with a messer and a dagger. So messer's kind of like a falchion, a machete with a cross guard, something like that. So he has that and a dagger, an ice pick grip dagger in his other hand. And he's indeed doing complex attacks and doing things like twisting, creating a hard parry and then twisting his opponent's weapon out of their hand. We have dual wielding of rapiers in the Renaissance. We have dual wielding of side swords, which is kind of like a little more less complex rapier from the early Renaissance. So indeed, we do have dual wielding, but the difference in the way the wording is you're going to attack 2 times at the exact same time. So if I attack you, I stab you in the face, and I'm going to stab you in the leg at the same time. You have to parry both, and you can't just pick one.
Right.
So you're either going to just completely back up out of range, or you're going to have to do some kind of sweeping motion, which is going to try and catch both of them up. And doing big sweeping motions usually ends you up in a trap, because if one of those motions misses the blade, or if you intentionally throw one short, their big sweeping motion comes through and they're open afterward. You can then stab them because they've used their tempo to try and parry both. They failed. You use the next tempo to stab them.
I
I hope
gotcha.
that explanation makes sense.
No, I think it does. I can kind of follow along with that. Uh, so would you say that it is a little bit more irregular to see dual wielding in like medieval combat? Because it feels like, at least from my very rudimentary knowledge of it, I mean, you have like stories of like Miyamoto Musashi from Japan, who like was kind of a legend because he fought with two swords. It was like unheard of. So is that kind of a more of a rarity, or were there schools that did that regularly?
So, absolutely, there were specialized dueling weapons. In particular, earlier I mentioned the longsword, bastard sword, hand and a half sword.
Mhm.
That's very much a weapon that, so it was only around from about 1350 to about 1550. That's really when it was popular, and there were some outliers before and after. But that's a weapon that was largely something that was for dueling schools. If you were a member of, there's a bunch of them. There's like Marx Bruders, there's the Johannes Lichtnauer, Brotherhood of Lichtnauer, and we know that these traditions that went on and on had people with longswords. The average person probably used a sword and buckler, maybe carried a sword, but someone who was a specialist, a specialized trained fighter, would have fought with something like, yeah, a pair of rapiers, a pair of side swords, rapier and dagger, a longsword. Like would other people have carried them? Yeah, sure. If they can afford it, sure. But generally speaking, there were indeed specialized weapons that had to do with certain schools of fighting. So yeah, that certainly was a thing.
Interesting. Uh, so here's my next big question to piggyback off that is was that more common, like schools for dueling weapons, like dual wielding essentially? Was that more common than like a school that would just focus on a longsword or just a spear or what have you?
So the manuals kind of indicate that you would learn like a big array of things. And probably each different kind of lineage of schools. And there's so many that were lost. Like the few that we're looking through a keyhole. So the manuals that we have, the manuals that survived to us from the earliest ones from the late 1200s, early 1300s from Germany. These manuals are like, we know there was like many, many more. And they either got, a basement flood, a library burned down, World War I, World War II, Napoleon, like all these things happened. So really, we're looking through a keyhole with all the information that we have. Um, but generally speaking, it seems that you would kind of learn like an array of things. So often when you'd see like a portrait of a fencer back in the day, you'd be like, this is the famous fencing maestro. And they'd show like, Johannes Lichtnauer sitting in a chair, or people later on. I want to say Fig comes in. There's a picture of Fig in this way. But they would, on the ground in front of them or on the wall behind them in the portrait, you'd see like weapons hanging on the wall, weapons on the floor. And it kind of like was indicating like, these are the things that I'm a master of. There's a
Oh,
quarterstaff, there's a dusok, which is kind of like a cutlass. There'd be a longsword on the wall and like like things lying around. So you would know like, oh, this guy trains with these are the things, these are his things. That one portrait is like, think about, everybody's got a friend who like posts way too many pictures and videos of them at the gym.
uh-huh.
You know what I mean? Imagine it's kind of like that, where they're just like, they're showing this array of things in their portrait, like, look what I've been up to. Um,
Okay. And so we can tell from those portraits then that there wasn't just their schools weren't just like about one weapon. It was about like a series of weapons that they would learn all about all these different kinds.
yes, that's absolutely right.
Okay.
Sometimes have, for example, if it's for something like a judicial duel, which is trial by combat, which is not exactly like how we see it in Game of Thrones or whatever, but it's in the ballpark. It's enough for you to understand this anecdote. Someone might come to you and say, I have to fight this duel in this many days. Please teach me how to win this duel. And so Talhofer or Fiore or whomever might be so inclined to take your money in exchange, they would teach you how to do this. There's a lot of anecdotes about this. If you read McBain, so there's a 17th and 18th century Scottish fencing master named Donald McBain, who was a bad person, but he was a good fighter. That's the case with a lot of these people. And he talks specifically about how he had a quartermaster when he was in the army. He had a quartermaster who wouldn't give him his weekly pay. He'd be like, "You have food, whatever, man," and he would just harass him all the time. So he challenged him to a duel, and he managed to borrow a sword off of his friend. And he went to the local fencing master and said, "Hey, teach me how to fight with this thing." He said, "Okay." 2 weeks later, he goes to fight the guy, gets his butt kicked, runs away, loses his friend's sword, goes back to the fencing master and says, "Hey, I had to fight a guy with a broadsword, and all I have is a small sword, which is kind of like a thin dueling sword. How do I do this?" So the guy says, "Okay." And he trains him for a little while again. And sure enough, McBain goes back and defeats the guy. Spoiler alert. Sorry, you've had like 200 years to read this book. It's fine. But yeah, and so he defeats him. And so indeed, like, people maybe would show up and be like, "Hey, I have to do this thing with this weapon. This is what I've got. Please show me this thing." But if you were going there as a whole, just to round out your, who you are as a person, to learn this art because you're a noble, or you have to lead troops, or you have to lead people, or rule, or whatever, you probably get a big education with using a bunch of different weapons. And probably also that would include things like wrestling, dagger, all sorts of things.
I gotcha. Now, on the subject of wrestling, we haven't really brought up grappling, which in Dungeons and Dragons doesn't happen especially often unless you like build your character to want to like grab. But that's probably a little bit more common in real life because, even thinking back to like the fights in elementary school and like on the playground, it was basically just devolve into like grabs and, chokeholds and stuff.
This is very true. Not the school fights.
Oh, right.
So, in particular, the manual I love to work with is called the Fiore di Battaglia, which is, again, it's by Fiore di Libertis. It was written in the early 15th century about his experience fighting duels and things, and training condottieri, which are like contract killers, mercenaries, lots of knights and nobles. I would say the overwhelming majority of the book involves grappling plays. It involves like somebody's trying to kill you, you parry once, you grab them and you cut them. Somebody's trying to stab you with a dagger, you grab their hand in the way and you deal with it. But almost like every play, like one of the safest things you can do is you can grab that person's weapon handle, grab their hand, grab something. And because it's the only way that sword isn't going to swing back around and kill you, is that if you have it in your hand. I think it's Gerard Thibault. Who writes it's a rapier master from the late Renaissance, and he writes, to hold somebody's sword is to hold their life in your hand. As soon as you have control of that sword, they're done. You decide if they live or die or not. And so grappling is like hugely important, critical part of sword fighting, as per what we see in all the manuals I've worked with.
Interesting. So that's definitely something that's not as big in Dungeons and Dragons. You'll have maybe certain monsters or something in D&D will have combat abilities where it's like, well, you get hit and you're grabbed, and it's more of like a lockdown, keep you in place kind of game mechanic thing. Whereas, yeah, in real life, it sounds like it's sort of the opposite. It's like, oh God, they got my weapon, I'm dead.
A lot of fighters, tournament fighters, everybody, like, it's for many people, rushing in and grabbing people is your bread and butter. It's a tournament winner if you know how to use it right. It can be, and in real life it would have been life or death. Grappling can be very, very critically important. Yeah.
Interesting. Now, here's another question. It's mentioned, you talk to people about the past, and it's like, oh, the past was a really violent time. Which I'm sure it was, but it dawns on me that it must be more violent than I imagined. If like you're talking about like, oh well, you had to go fight all these duels and stuff. It's like, how common was dueling?
So this is what I will say. If we're looking to study the medieval period just from looking at manuscripts that are specifically about sword fighting, you're going to get a weird image of of how things were going to
Yeah,
get.
that's fair.
And people were getting stabbed left and right. You know, mad. You go out into the world and everyone's trying to kill you. But like the reality is that like, well, I'll paint you two pictures. People are still just people. You know what I mean? If you had a hard life, you know, that didn't mean you didn't celebrate holidays. It didn't mean you didn't decorate your house or have friends or family. You know, they were still just, they were humans and they didn't want to suffer and they didn't want to live in a community that was unsafe. Here's the bad news. If we look,
I knew there was bad news coming.
bad news is that if you look at like things like the murder rate in medieval London, late medieval London versus the murder rate in modern London, it was 10 times higher in medieval London. So you were 10 times more likely to get murdered in medieval London than you are modern London.
Wow. Cool, blimey.
Yeah. Yeah. So like
Wow.
So the good news is that, you know, humans are still humans. They're going to start fights. They're going to get into brawls, and people are going to try and hurt each other, you know, or not, because they don't really want to most of the time. The bad news is that when they did, it usually it ended badly. There's no medicine. There's no understanding of germs. There's you know, there's the medical science was very primitive back then.
It makes me feel better that, you know, when I have like frequent bandit attacks in Dungeons and Dragons, that, you know, really I should be upping those numbers. Like I should be upping them considerably to make them a little bit more true to the medieval style.
I'll give you a cool one. There's a weird thing. I'm not really sure why this happens. Maybe somebody who knows more about naturalism can tell me this. But there's a weird thing where in the Carpathian Mountains in the medieval period, 1/4 of all the wolves in Europe lived in the Carpathian Mountains. Like what? Like, oh my god, it would be horrible to live there. It would just be just like, you know, like if you wanted to have like constant monster attacks in Dungeons and Dragons, like, you know, maybe that's not like crazy. That's depending on where you live. It's not crazy. I know the one that I often bring up to people is if you go back to like the times of ancient Greece, there were bears and lions all around the Mediterranean.
Wow.
Eventually, yeah, they died off, but like it paints a very different picture of like ancient Greece when you imagine that like if you're traveling along the roads, you had to worry about getting attacked by a pride of lions, you know what I mean, or dealing with a bear or something.
Man,
Very important.
it's interesting that, you know, like, yeah, I would say that it's less likely you'll see bears and lions in Dungeons and Dragons because, you know, it's such a fantastical setting. And certainly as you level up, mechanically, bears and lions will be outdone by, you know, manticores and sphinxes and, you know, what have you. But it kind of puts my mind at ease that, you know, having such dangerous kind of situations in Dungeons and Dragons is sort of a weird, true reflection to real life. Just, you know, instead of bears, it's owl bears, and, you know, instead of you know, lions, it's manticores. It's nice to know that.
I once heard a weird story. This is getting a bit off topic, but I once heard a weird story about Lewis and Clark
Mm-hmm.
when they were on their expedition across to find the West Coast,
Yeah.
going across America, and they first encountered a grizzly bear, and they were just like, "Oh no!" like they had no, you know, they were just like, "Oh my god, it's huge."
What the hell is that?
So indeed, like if you were in an unknown land in Dungeons and Dragons, and you're on your adventure, you know what I mean, you don't really know what you're getting into. Um,
Yeah.
we're going into a cave. Nobody's really been in this cave before.
Oh no, trolls.
And then we're like, we brought weapons to fight humans, and then suddenly, you know.
Yeah. So here's a question. In Dungeons and Dragons, weapons, you know, are used for everything. Humans, monsters, you know. If you were, you know, if you had like a long sword or dagger or, you know, something a little bit more traditional as a weapon in medieval times, would that help you against wolves and bears and other large like mammals and creatures that could potentially mangle you?
Oh man, this is a weird question. I'm trying. We don't really have much in the manuscripts that I work with and that the human community works with. I don't know that they really have enough data to answer this question, I could answer it in my opinion.
Sure, by all means. Opinion it up.
Okay, if I had to fight some kind of a big beast like an owl bear or something, I think I'd want like something I could keep it away with, I could hit hard with, and I could stab with it and keep it at range. So something like a poleaxe would be a great choice. Maybe this is backed up a bit. If you look at some of the manuals we work with, we do see pole arms versus cavalry. And so fighting an armored man on a horse, that's about the biggest, scariest thing you could ever run into, as per what the manuscripts tell us. Like that's the thing you don't want to run into in all these duels we see depicted. We see in Fiore di Liberty, I always reference, we have a weapon called a gavarina. And a gavarina is it's kind of like a sword on the end of a stick.
Oh.
It's like 7 foot long, and it's kind of like a 2 foot, 2 to 3 foot sword blade with a cross guard on the end of like a 4 foot-ish stick, something like this. And it's depicted, you see it, there's a cool posture he's using called a boar's tusk, the dente de cinghiaro, the boar's tusk posture, and he's using it to fight against an armored man on horseback. So maybe if you wanted to, if man, that's a tough one though. Yeah, if I was asked to fight a big beast, I'd probably take a pole arm. I'd probably take like Fiore did when he fought the man on a horse. That's about the best I got.
No, I appreciate the honesty that because I feel like the gut reaction of most people would be to just be like, oh yeah, I could take something like that. Give me any weapon, whatever. I appreciate the honesty that you're like, I don't want to do that, but if I had to, I guess I'd take this weapon.
I mean, like ideally, you'd want to get it with like a granado, like a bomb, or like
Right.
something. Get him a high-powered windlass crossbow, bam. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want to get near, something like that. And if it was something like even like a magical opponent, like a mind flayer, or like you don't want to get anywhere near that guy. You don't know. We don't know what the range of his spells are. So I would say, yeah, man, get him from a distance for sure.
Okay. I so as we're kind of winding down here, I would you say that the in the rock scissor paper of medieval combat, it sounds like it's gonna just distill it down to like the most simple and almost insulting way, but like, would you feel that like is crossbow just the ultimate weapon? Like, does it just trump whatever because it's just at so far a distance?
Wow. So I would say, depending on the range, not necessarily.
Okay.
You have, so I've seen a competition of the best guys at using a sling in the world.
Uh-huh.
The world sling term. They have, it's just like a piece of string with a loop with a rock in it, or a piece of like lead shot, like size of a golf ball.
Yeah.
Fling them, and they hit this almost the same range. I think it is the exact same range as like the world, range for archery.
Wow.
So I would say if you had anything you could hit from a distance, it's just a matter how quick you can do it. Because if you're trying to shoot a moving target, they're going to move around, and that crossbow is going to be slower to reload than a bow. Maybe even slower than a sling. Probably for sure slower than a sling. Now I think about it. So yeah, I would say hit them with something ranged, and like people did.
Yeah, I would imagine that was probably the preferred method of combat, not even being close, essentially point and click interface.
The one that springs to mind is I think it's again in Talhofer's, it's in Hans Talhofer. I think it's in the 1465 Württemberg Treatise. He has how to use a crossbow on a horse. Oh. And this includes things like how to fire a crossbow backwards when you're riding away from someone on a horse.
That's slick.
Which is like, how would you even do it? Like he shows you, like, here's how I do it. And so like, I would say if you wanted to be as safe as you could feasibly be, I would say get yourself a crossbow and a horse.
Okay, so when the manticore, with an owl bear on its back lands, the preferred method of combat is on a horse, moving away, launching a crossbow bolt behind your back.
Well, I don't want to tangle with the manticore, so yeah. Great. Give me the fastest horse you got.
Kyle, it has been a pleasure chatting with you here. What are your final thoughts when it comes to the differences and similarities between fantasy and real life medieval combat.
My closing thoughts are be skeptical. Anything you might have apprehensions about, you think that doesn't sound quite right in the mechanics. Evaluate it, test things out, read some books. All these manuscripts or a lot of them are free in the public domain. Like we have the writings of the people who actually fought with these weapons. We have their lessons and their illustrations and things. Like, do the research. It's not that hard. Um, don't take anything for its worth. Do the research yourself. Look it up. Stay skeptical about all this stuff.
I appreciate that. The only thing I can think to add to that is, you know, Dungeons and Dragons is at its core is an interactive story.
Mm.
And if you as a dungeon master or game master, are playing this game, if you feel like there's something that doesn't make much sense, maybe you prefer it more in a realistic setting or what have you can change the rules as you please. You're the one in control of the game. The game mechanics work well enough for me, as a dungeon master. So I don't really ever have too much of a need of changing things like that. The 1 in 20 odds that you horribly hurt yourself, that seems about right to me, as clumsy as I am. So, I have no issues with things like that. But yeah, it's the game mechanics are there to, kind of disassemble and play with as you please. But Kyle, you are captain for the Michigan Medieval organization. Tell us about that organization and what you do.
Okay, so Michigan Medieval, we've been around for 14 years now. Oh my gosh.
Wow.
I would say very few people ever come into the world of sword fighting without having Dungeons and Dragons or other role playing games have made an impact on their life. And so a lot of these people come into it, and they already know a little bit about it. So we do full contact fighting with real weapons, but they're blunt. And we wear modern protective equipment. And what we do is we try and take these old manuscripts that describe fighting techniques. And a lot of them are from like the medieval period and the Renaissance, and sometimes later. And we try and use our skills as martial artists and fencers to kind of breathe life back into them, to figure them out. So for a long time, I did Japanese martial arts, where it was like a student to master lineage going back, generations.
Mm-hmm.
But for doing medieval combat from Europe, everybody died, or they turned, or they kind of like evolved it into more up to the minute kind of weapons. So somebody in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, they're not going to be fighting with the same thing. So and those traditions slowly died off. And so we have to bring them back again. We don't have a sensei we can turn to ask. We have to just look at the manuscripts and, we'll figure techniques out. We'll go to a tournament, or we'll host a tournament. We'll try out our techniques and we'll fight really hard, and then maybe it didn't work. And so we got to go, maybe our interpretation was wrong. We go back to the drawing board, look at those manuscripts, look at those illustrations again, and say, oh, his sword was on the left, not the right. He started with this foot forward, kind of figure it out. And it's been an ongoing process for me personally for about 14 years now. Yeah, we have weekly classes that meet up. Right now we're doing online classes because of COVID. But we've had weekly classes meeting up, going on for many years now. We are open to anybody to come join us. We love doing demonstrations at Comic-Cons and demonstrations at Scottish Games and that sort of thing. We did some demonstrations for a public library, and we worked with a high school to teach them about manuscripts. But yeah, we always recruiting new people.
That's awesome. And when it comes to the fantasy side of things, I have a podcast called Noobs and Dragons. Basically, I take beginners to Dungeons and Dragons, who are part of my podcasting network and stuff. Bring in guests as that are Twitch streamers, things like that, and we go through a Dungeons and Dragons adventure. So season 1 of the show is all about a group of adventurers who are given a strange book, a dream journal from an ally of theirs, and are told to bring it to a wizard in town and see if they can analyze the dreams. And more strange things keep happening. and what's going on behind the scenes. That's season one, and then season two is all about adventurers being brought into a city where people are going missing, and some people are saying it's a giant monster eating people. What's really going on? Does anyone control the monster? What released it? It's a big giant mystery. So yeah, if any of those sound interesting to you, track them down on your favorite podcasting apps. Otherwise, you can go to GameZillaMedia.com, where we have a whole bunch of other podcasts, including The Legend of Retro, where I cover old video games. If you're wondering why I referenced Bushido Blade earlier.
Hey, the one last thing I want to ambush you here with, Craig, is...
Yeah.
Craig, remember the first time you and I ever played Dungeons & Dragons together? Do you remember what year it was?
Oh, gosh, that was a long time ago. That'd have been, let's see, 07?
I think it was 2008.
2008.
I think it was 2007 or 2008, but it was a long time ago. It just hit me. I was like, oh, man.
Yeah, you had a one of your first big characters in D&D I can think of was Erasmus, the Scion.
Yes, of course. The way yes, the great Erasmus, the Scion, the wizard. He was just a very cadre old man. I don't know why that inspired me. I thought that was a lot funnier of a joke when I was like 19. Oh, an old man.
He was a fun character. I liked Erasmus. Just all these like ridiculous things about how he had goblin wars when he was young.
Very young at the time. Yeah, honestly, in my current Dungeons and Dragons campaigns I run with my friends in my group nowadays in 2021, Erasmus and some of the characters that you helped kind of create back in the day, they're still around. Like, they're still relevant characters in my campaigns.
Oh, that's great.
So thanks.
Anytime. It's I when it comes to Dungeons and Dragons, I am a firm proponent of steal everything. Whatever you want, steal it. It's okay. If you get an idea, like if you watch a cartoon or an anime or a movie and you're like, man, I really wish I could have the adventures of John Wick, take it. Have one of your heroes' dog get stolen and they got to get it back. Whatever. Have the adventure of John Wick. It's okay. It doesn't matter. Steal it.
Oh, man. I'll to be fair, I totally believe in public domain HEMA sources. So all the manuscripts that we work with, very few of them aren't for free. They're so old.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna say very few, but you can get a wealth of old manuscripts about sword fighting for free. Scans of them, translations of them. There's an international effort of people who transcribe and scan and translate this and make fundraisers to get the rights to them from like the Nuremberg Historical Library or wherever, whatever it is. And then we in the sword fighting community, we get to be the capstone on the pyramid and get to do the fun part and actually fight it out and see how the techniques work. So yeah, I'm definitely a big supporter of having things be in the public domain and doing things for the betterment of people. I mean, essentially, we're like an educational force. Mm-hmm. And in these times, in COVID times, like the content creators, I really learned to appreciate content creators maybe more than I did. It inspired me to make some content, make some videos, make some reviews of things. Yeah, man, what can we do but just lift people's spirits in these times?
Yeah, absolutely. It's very scary times we're living in. And let's face it, life is kind of scary anyway, let alone when we're dealing with like a pandemic. So yeah, whatever it takes to get people's minds off things, make them happy. Hopefully, whether it's medieval combat or Dungeons and Dragons podcast, whatever it is, hopefully Kyle and I are of some assistance to you.
I'm glad to do my part.
Indeed. Well, Kyle, it has been a pleasure. But I'd just like to thank all our listeners for joining in and following us along. You can find, as I said, me over at GameZillaMedia.com. And Kyle, what's your website?
You can find us at MichiganMedieval.com. You can find us at Facebook.com/MichiganMedieval, Instagram.com/MichiganMedieval. And we also have a YouTube account that we've been adding a lot of stuff to recently. So please come check us out.
Yeah, you heard the man. And we're going to go ahead and catch you next time. Thanks for listening.
Cheers.